Some doors don't knock twice. They wait until you're alone. The hallway light outside Nia Brooks' apartment flickered like it was running out of patience, casting a pale glow under the door, stretching shadows across the hardwood floor as the clock on her wall ticked past 12:03 a.m., each second louder than the last. Each breath in her chest just a little tighter, because Marcus wasn't supposed to be back until Sunday, and nobody else had a key, and yet the knock came again, slow this time, deliberate, not loud but certain, like whoever stood on the other side knew she would open it eventually. Nia didn't move right away, her fingers resting against the edge of the kitchen counter, her mind scanning through every name, every possibility, none of them fitting the weight of that sound, until finally she stepped forward, each footfall quiet, controlled, the way she had learned to move through rooms that didn't belong to her, the way she had learned to hold herself together when things didn't make sense. Her hand hovered over the handle for just a second, then turned it, the latch clicking open like a decision she couldn't take back. The door creaked just enough to reveal a figure standing in the dim corridor, a woman, younger than her, shoulders tense, breath uneven, eyes rimmed with something heavier than exhaustion, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence thick, stretched thin between them until the woman's voice broke it, soft but urgent. "He said you wouldn't turn me away." And Nia's brow tightened, confusion flickering across her face because Marcus had never mentioned anything like this, never mentioned her, never mentioned anyone who would show up like this in the middle of the night. And then Nia's gaze dropped, just slightly, enough to notice the way the woman's hand pressed protectively against her stomach, enough to catch the tremor in her fingers, enough to see the folded paper slipping loose from her grip, drifting down in slow motion until it touched the floor between them. Nia bent without thinking, picked it up, unfolded it halfway, and the world didn't shatter, it didn't explode, it just shifted, quiet and precise, like something heavy being placed exactly where it didn't belong, because printed at the top in clean black letters was a name she hadn't said out loud in over a year, a name that carried boardrooms and headlines and silence behind it. Ethan Cole. And Nia's breath caught, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to pause the rhythm in her chest as her eyes lifted back to the woman standing in her doorway, still waiting, still holding herself together like she had nowhere else to go. And for the first time that night Nia understood that this wasn't about Marcus, not really, that whatever had just knocked on her door had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with a truth that had been walking toward her long before midnight. And somewhere down the hall, beyond the flicker of that failing light, the low hum of an engine cut through the silence as headlights washed across the walls, stopping right outside her building, as if the man whose name she held in her hands had already arrived to claim the moment she hadn't even had time to refuse. The engine outside did not turn off. It stayed low and steady like it was waiting for permission, and Nia felt that sound settle into the room before either of them moved again, before she even realized she was still holding the paper in her hand, her eyes tracing the printed name one more time, as if it might change if she looked long enough. But it did not. It stayed there, sharp and undeniable, Ethan Cole, and the woman in front of her shifted slightly, pulling her jacket tighter around herself, her voice quieter now, almost careful. "I did not know where else to go." And Nia finally stepped back from the doorway, not as an invitation, not yet, just enough to breathe, just enough to think. But the hallway light flickered again, and the woman flinched, and something in that small movement made the decision for her. Nia opened the door wider without a word, and the woman stepped inside slowly, like she was crossing into a place she was not sure she deserved, and the door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing the moment into something real. The apartment felt different now, smaller somehow, the air heavier. As Nia walked toward the kitchen and placed the sonogram flat on the counter, smoothing it out with the palm of her hand, her movements controlled, precise, because that was the only way. She knew how to handle things that threatened to unravel everything at once. "Sit," she said, her voice calm, not unkind, but not warm either, and the woman obeyed, lowering herself carefully onto the edge of the chair, one hand still resting over her stomach like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Nia leaned against the counter, arms crossed lightly, eyes fixed on her. "Start from the beginning," she said, and the woman swallowed, her gaze dropping for a moment before she spoke. "Marcus knew And the words landed wrong, heavy and immediate, because Nia's jaw tightened just slightly, her mind already trying to reject that possibility. But the woman continued before she could respond. He told me it would be easier this way, that no one needed to know yet. And Nia let out a slow breath through her nose. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet shift in understanding. Easier for who? She asked. And the woman looked up then, eyes glistening but steady. For him, she said, and the truth of that sat between them, sharp and simple. Nia glanced back at the paper on the counter, at the name that did not belong in her life anymore, at the connection that had just been placed in her hands without her consent, and then she asked the question she had been holding back. Does he know? And the woman hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking, and then she nodded once, slow. He knows. And the engine outside cut off at that exact moment, the sudden silence. Pressing against the windows, against the walls, against Nia's chest like a signal that whatever distance had existed a minute ago was gone now. Footsteps echoed faintly from outside, measured, unhurried, and Nia did not move toward the door this time. She did not rush, did not react. She simply straightened slightly, her expression settling into something quieter, something firmer, because she understood now that this was not a coincidence. This was not a mistake that had wandered into her life. This was a decision that had found her. And when the knock came again, softer than before, but no less certain, Nia did not look surprised. She just looked at the woman sitting across from her and said, "Whatever happens next, you do not speak unless I ask you to." And then she turned, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation, meeting the man on the other side not with shock, not with anger, but with a calm that did not belong to someone caught off guard. Because Ethan Cole stood there in a dark coat, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving past her for just a second, as if confirming something only he understood, and then back to her. And for the first time since she had known him, he did not lead with control. He did not lead with authority. He spoke quietly, almost carefully. "Is she safe?" And Nia held his gaze, unblinking, the question settling between them like a line that had already been crossed, and she answered in the same calm tone, "That depends on why you are here." For a moment, neither of them moved, the open doorway holding a tension that did not need to be spoken, and Nia stood there with one hand resting lightly against the edge of the door, as if she could control the space simply by deciding how wide it stayed, her eyes steady on Ethan Cole's face, watching for the version of him she remembered, the one who measured every word, every move, every outcome. But the man standing in front of her now did not carry that same sharp edge, his posture still, straight, his coat perfectly tailored, but something quieter sat behind his eyes, something that did not belong to a man used to winning every room he entered. "I am here because I should have been here sooner," he said, his voice low and even, not defensive, not rushed, and Nia let the words settle without reacting, her silence stretching just long enough to remind him that this was not his space to control. She stepped aside then, not as permission, but as acknowledgement, and he walked in. Slowly, his gaze flicking once toward the woman seated at the kitchen table before returning to Nia, as if he was choosing his focus carefully, as if he understood that whatever conversation happened next would not be led by him. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the apartment fell into a stillness that felt heavier than before. Three people, now sharing a truth that had not been spoken out loud yet. Nia moved back toward the counter, positioning herself between Ethan and the sonogram, still lying flat under the kitchen light, her hand resting beside it, not covering it, but not offering it either. And Ethan noticed, of course he noticed, his eyes lowering briefly to the paper before lifting again, his jaw tightening just slightly, the only sign that the image held more weight than he was willing to show. "You already know," she said, her tone calm, almost neutral, and he nodded once, slow. "Yes," he answered, and the simplicity of that response shifted something in the room. Because there was no denial, no attempt to reshape the truth into something easier, just a quiet acceptance that made the situation more real, not less. The woman at the table glanced between them, her hands clasped now, her breathing more controlled but still uneven, and Nia did not look at her, not yet, her focus still fixed on Ethan as she asked, "And you let him handle it?" And this time there was a pause, a small one, but enough to change the air, enough to show that this part did not sit as cleanly. And Ethan exhaled slowly before answering. I believed he would not complicate it. And Nia's lips pressed together for just a second, not in anger, but in recognition. Complicate, she repeated, the word landing heavier than he intended, because what stood in front of them was not a complication. It was a life. It was a consequence that had been delayed, redirected, handed off like it could be managed from a distance. She picked up the sonogram then, holding it up just enough for him to see clearly, the faint outline on the paper catching the light. This is not something you delegate, she said quietly, and for the first time, Ethan's composure shifted more visibly, not breaking, but bending, his gaze lingering on the image longer now, his shoulders lowering just slightly as if the weight of it had finally settled where it belonged. The woman's voice came softly from the table. I did not come here for anything from you, she said, her words careful, steady, and both of them turned toward her. I came because I could not carry this alone anymore. And Nia watched Ethan as he absorbed that, watched the way his expression changed not with shock, but with understanding, a slow realization that this moment was not about control, not about reputation, not about what could be managed behind closed doors, but about what had already happened and could no longer be undone. Nia set the paper back down on the counter, her hand resting beside it again, grounding herself in the stillness she refused to lose, and then she spoke, her voice even, firm. You do not get to decide how this ends. And Ethan looked at her, really looked at her this time, not as an employee, not as someone within his reach, but as the person standing between what he had ignored and what he now had to face. And he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I am not here to decide, he said quietly. I am here to take responsibility. And Nia held his gaze for a long second before responding. Then start by telling the truth. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting, because whatever he said next would not just explain what had happened. It would define who he was when he no longer had the power to hide behind anything else. Truth does not hesitate. It waits until you are ready to hear it. And Ethan Cole did not rush his next words. He stood there in the quiet of Nia's apartment, the city lights faint through the window behind him, his reflection barely visible in the glass, as if even the night refused to fully hold him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but stripped of the control it once carried. It started before I knew what it would become, he said, not looking at Nia at first but at the edge of the counter, at the sonogram that had already said more than any explanation could. I met her during a transition period, when everything in my company was shifting, when decisions were being made quickly, and I treated that moment the same way I treated everything else, like it would pass if I managed it correctly. And Nia listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her silence not passive but intentional, giving his words space to either stand or fall on their own. He continued, when I found out about the pregnancy, I did not deny it, but I did not step into it either. And that sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it carried the weight of choice, not accident. And Nia's eyes sharpened just slightly. You chose distance, she said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it without defense. Yes, and the simplicity of that answer made it harder to dismiss, not easier. The woman at the table lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening together, but she did not speak, holding onto the boundary Nia had set, and Nia turned her attention fully back to Ethan. And Marcus, she said, and Ethan's jaw shifted again, a flicker of something more complicated. Crossing his expression, Marcus knew the situation, he replied. He offered to handle the logistics, to keep things contained, to prevent unnecessary attention. And Nia let out a slow breath, the word contained echoing in her mind like something that had been packaged and pushed aside. You trusted him to contain a life, she said, not raising her voice, not accusing, just stating it in a way that made it impossible to soften. And Ethan met her gaze directly this time. I trusted him because I did not want to confront what it required from me, he said. And there it was, not strategy, not calculation, but avoidance. And for the first time since he had entered the apartment, the truth sounded like something real, something human. Nia looked down at the sonogram again, then back at him, her expression steady. And now, she asked, what does it require from you now? and Ethan did not answer immediately. Not because he did not know, but because he understood that whatever he said next would not be measured by intention, it would be measured by action. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more grounded. "Everything I should have given from the beginning," he said, and the words did not try to impress. They did not try to repair. They simply existed, and that made them harder to dismiss. The woman at the table exhaled softly, a small release of tension that had been building since the moment she arrived. And Nia noticed, not with sympathy, but with awareness, because this was no longer just about what Ethan would say. It was about what would happen next. She stepped away from the counter then, moving slowly into the center of the room, placing herself where both of them could see her clearly, her presence grounding the space in a way neither of them could replicate. "Then you start by removing him from this," she said, her tone firm, decisive. "Marcus does not get to stand between what is yours to face." And Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in resistance, but in realization, because that meant undoing something he had already allowed to be built. And after a brief pause, he nodded. "He will not be involved anymore," he said, and Nia held his gaze, measuring not just the words, but the weight behind them. And then she gave a small nod, not approval, but acknowledgement. "Good," she said quietly, because this was never his to carry. And the room fell into a different kind of silence, not tense, not uncertain, but transitional, like something had shifted into place. And for the first time since the knock at the door, the direction of what would come next no longer felt hidden. It felt inevitable. Responsibility sounds simple until it asks something back from you. And Nia watched Ethan closely as the weight of his own words settled into the room, not rushing him, not filling the silence, because she understood something he was only just beginning to learn, that truth did not need pressure to grow, it only needed space. And the apartment held that space now, steady and unyielding. As the woman at the table finally lifted her head again, her voice quieter but stronger than before, "I did not come here for promises," she said, her eyes moving between them with a kind of calm that came from having nothing left to lose. "I came because I needed this to be real." And Nia turned slightly toward her, acknowledging her without softening. "It is real," she said, her tone even. "That is why it feels like this." And the woman nodded, her hand still resting over her stomach. But this time it looked less like protection and more like grounding, like she was holding on to something that no longer felt invisible. Ethan stepped further into the room then, not toward either of them directly, but into the center, placing himself where he could not stand apart anymore. His presence no longer something that dominated the space, but something that had to fit inside it. And he spoke again, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "There will be no more distance," he said, not as a declaration, but as a commitment he understood would be tested. "No more intermediaries, no more silence." And Nia watched him for a long second before responding, her gaze steady, measuring not just the words but the intention behind them. "Words are easy when they come late," she said quietly, and he did not argue, did not defend. He simply nodded, accepting the truth of that without trying to reshape it. And that, more than anything, shifted the atmosphere again, because for the first time, his presence did not feel like resistance, it felt like acknowledgement. Nia moved back toward the counter, picking up the sonogram once more, but this time she did not hold it up. She turned it slightly and placed it in front of the woman instead, sliding it gently across the surface, returning it to where it belonged. "This is yours," she said, and the woman's fingers hovered over it for a moment before touching it lightly, her breath catching just slightly, as if the image had changed now that it was no longer hidden, now that it had been seen and spoken and recognized. And Ethan's eyes followed that movement, not reaching, not claiming, just witnessing. And there was something in that restraint that felt new, something that had not existed when this situation was first handed off to someone else. "What happens next is not about repair," Nia continued, her voice calm but firm. "It is about consistency." And Ethan looked at her, his expression focused. "Then tell me what that looks like," he said, not as a challenge, but as a question he was willing to hear the answer to. And Nia held his gaze, unshaken. "It looks like showing up before you are asked," she said. "It looks like choosing this when it is inconvenient, when it is uncomfortable, when it does not fit your schedule or your image. And each word landed clearly, not harsh, but undeniable. And it looks like understanding that you do not get to define the outcome. And Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing it, not pushing back, not negotiating, just taking it in, and after a moment, he nodded once. Then that is where I start, he said. And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything more elaborate could have. The woman at the table looked up at him then, really looking this time, not with expectation, not with hope, but with a kind of quiet clarity. Starting is not the same as staying, she said softly, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. I understand that, he replied, and Nia watched that exchange carefully, her presence still the center of the room, still the balance that held everything in place. And for the first time since the knock at the door, the tension that had filled the space began to shift into something steadier, something that did not rely on what had been hidden or avoided, but on what was now being faced, and Nia knew this was only the beginning, not of a resolution, but of a process that would reveal more than any of them were prepared for, because truth, once opened, did not close quietly. It expanded, it reached into places that had been left untouched, and it demanded to be seen all the way through. Some truths do not arrive louder, they arrive deeper, settling into the room until no one can ignore what they mean. And Nia could feel that shift now, not in the volume of the conversation, but in the way silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt defined, like each of them understood that what came next would not be decided in a single moment, but revealed over time. She leaned back slightly against the counter, her arms relaxed, but her posture still grounded, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention, but commanded it anyway. And Ethan stood across from her, no longer at the threshold, no longer separate. His position in the room a quiet acknowledgement that he was part of what had to be faced, not outside of it. The woman at the table, still holding the sonogram lightly between her fingers, glanced down at it once more before setting it carefully in front of her. Aligning it with the edge of the table as if placing it in the right position made everything feel just a little more stable, and when she spoke again, her voice carried less fear and more clarity. I cannot do this in the shadows anymore, she said, her eyes lifting to meet Ethan's, not challenging, not pleading, simply stating a boundary that had already been crossed too many times, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. You will not have to, he answered, and there was no pause, no calculation, just a direct response that landed cleanly. Nia watched that exchange without interrupting, her attention moving between them, reading not just what was said, but what was not, and she stepped forward slightly, closing the distance by a small but intentional measure. Then understand what that means, she said, her voice even, measured. It means there is no version of this that stays hidden, no version that fits neatly into your world without changing it. And Ethan met her gaze, his expression steady. I know, he said, and this time the words did not feel like assumption. They felt like acceptance. And Nia nodded once, acknowledging it without softening her stance, because knowing was not the same as doing, and she needed him to understand that difference. The quiet hum of the city outside pressed faintly against the windows, a distant reminder that the world beyond this apartment continued without pause, unaware of the shift happening inside, unaware that something controlled and carefully managed had just begun to unravel into something real. And Nia turned her attention back to the woman, her tone shifting slightly, not warmer, but more direct. You are not here by accident, she said. You made a choice to come here. And the woman nodded, her shoulders straightening just a little. I did, she said, and there was strength in that admission, not loud, not dramatic, but present, and Nia held her gaze for a moment before continuing. Then you get to define what you need from this, not him. And the woman's eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan before returning to Nia, as if recalibrating where her focus belonged, and after a second, she spoke again. I need consistency, she said quietly, echoing the word Nia had used before, but this time it carried her own weight, her own expectation, and Ethan listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, just standing there as the meaning of that settled into him. And he nodded once. Then that is what you will have, he said, and again, there was no defense in his tone, no attempt to justify what had come before. only a forward movement that would either hold or break depending on what followed. Nia exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting between them one more time before settling into something resolved, because the moment had moved past explanation, past acknowledgement, and into something quieter but more demanding, a space where words would no longer carry the weight alone, where actions would begin to define everything that came after. And she stepped back slightly, giving them both the space they would need to either meet that expectation or fail it, her voice calm as she spoke one final time in that moment. "Then do not wait for the next crisis to prove it," she said, and the room held that sentence like a line drawn clearly across what had been and what would be. And for the first time since the door had opened, there was no question about whether things would change, only a quiet understanding that they already had. The room did not return to what it was before, because once something is named, it cannot go back to being unspoken, and Nia felt that shift settle into the walls, into the air, into the way each of them stood a little differently now, as if the space itself had redefined them. She moved toward the window, not to leave the moment, but to give it shape, her reflection faint against the glass as the city lights stretched out beyond her, steady and indifferent. And for a second, she let herself breathe without speaking, because silence, when chosen, had power, and when she turned back, her gaze was sharper, more focused, like she had decided exactly where this was going next. Ethan had not moved much, but there was a subtle difference in how he held himself, less guarded, less removed, as if he had stepped fully into a situation he could not step out of again. And the woman at the table sat straighter now, her shoulders no longer curved inward, her presence no longer apologetic, and Nia saw that, acknowledged it without comment, before her attention returned to Ethan. "There is something else," she said, her voice even, but carrying a weight that made both of them listen more closely. "You did not just step away from responsibility." And Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not in denial, but in anticipation. "You allowed someone else to rewrite it." And the words landed with precision, because they pointed not just to what he had done, but to what had been done in his absence. Ethan's brow tightened just slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, and Nia did not rush her answer. She let the moment stretch just enough to make it clear that this was not speculation. This was something she had already pieced together. "Marcus did not just manage the situation," she said. "He reshaped it." And the woman at the table looked up quickly, her breath catching as if something unspoken had just been brought into the light, and Ethan's gaze moved to her, then back to Nia, sharper now, more alert. "Explain," he said, and this time there was a hint of urgency beneath his calm. Not loss of control, but the realization that there was more he had not seen. Nia stepped closer to the table, her hand resting lightly on the edge as she looked at the woman. "Tell him what you told me when you first arrived," she said. And the woman hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking, her voice steady but quieter. "Marcus told me to wait," she said. "He said timing mattered, that if this came out too soon, it would damage things that could not be repaired." And Ethan's jaw set, not in anger, but in recognition. "Damage what?" he asked, and the woman swallowed, her eyes dropping briefly before lifting again. "His position, your company, everything tied to your name," she said, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, because the truth was no longer just about avoidance. It was about manipulation, about someone taking control of a situation that was never theirs to control. Ethan looked down for a moment, his mind clearly moving through the implications, through the decisions that had been made in his absence. And when he looked back up, there was a clarity in his expression that had not been there before. He positioned himself as the solution, he said slowly, and Nia nodded once. "And in doing that, he made sure you stayed out of it," she replied, and Ethan exhaled quietly, the realization settling in fully now, not as a shock, but as something that made sense in a way he could no longer ignore. And Nia watched him carefully, because this was the moment that would define whether he truly understood what had happened or if he would retreat back into distance. The woman's voice came again, softer this time. "He said you agreed," she added, and Ethan's head turned toward her immediately. "I did not agree to that," he said, his tone firm but controlled, and Nia held his gaze. "But you made it possible," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, just a truth that stood on its own, and Ethan did not argue. He did not deflect. He simply nodded once, accepting it, and that acceptance carried more weight than any defense could have. Nia straightened slightly, her presence anchoring the room once again. "Then this does not just move forward," she said. "It corrects what was allowed to happen." And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Then it will be corrected," he replied, and for the first time, the direction of his response did not feel reactive. It felt intentional, and Nia watched him for a long second before giving a small nod, not because the situation was resolved, but because the truth had expanded, revealing not just what had been hidden, but how it had been handled. And now there was no version of this that could be simplified, no version that could be quietly contained, because what had been set in motion had already begun to unfold beyond anyone's control. Correction does not begin with action, it begins with exposure, and Nia could see that moment forming now, not in noise, not in confrontation, but in the quiet way Ethan's posture shifted as the full weight of Marcus's involvement settled into place. The realization not explosive but precise, like something aligning in his mind that could not be misinterpreted anymore. He stepped back slightly, just enough to create space between himself and the table, his hand brushing briefly against the edge of the chair before he let it fall to his side, his gaze no longer moving between them but focused, internal, calculating not for control but for clarity. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something different, not hesitation, not defense, but decision. He positioned himself as a gate, he said, more to himself than to them, controlling what reached me and what did not. And Nia watched him closely, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened, because this was the moment where understanding either turned into accountability or dissolved into explanation, and she did not intend to let it become the latter. The woman at the table shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the sonogram, as if the paper had become something more than an image, something that anchored her in a situation she had not created but now had to navigate. And her voice came again, softer but steady. "He told me you preferred it this way," she said, her eyes meeting Ethan's directly, and the words did not accuse, they revealed, and that made them harder to deflect. Ethan held her gaze, his expression firming. "I did not," he said, not louder, not sharper, just clear, and then his eyes moved to Nia, as if acknowledging that what came next would not be shaped by him alone, and Nia stepped forward slightly, closing the distance once more, her presence grounding the room in a way that neither of them could disrupt. "Preference is not the issue," she said, her tone even, controlled. "Permission is." And that distinction landed between them with quiet force, because it reframed everything, not as a misunderstanding, but as something that had been allowed to happen in the absence of direct action. Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing that, not resisting it, and nodded once. "Then I take that back," he said. And the statement was simple, but the implication behind it was not, because taking it back meant undoing more than just words. It meant stepping into consequences that had already begun to take shape. Nia held his gaze, measuring, then asked the question that mattered most. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood that whatever he said would not be judged by its logic, it would be judged by its execution. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but more certain. "By removing him completely," he said, "not just from this, but from anything that allowed him to control it." And the room stilled around that statement, because it was no longer about correction in theory, it was about action that would ripple outward, into business, into relationships, into structures that had been built on trust that no longer held. The woman's eyes flickered slightly at that, not with relief, not yet, but with recognition that something real was being set in motion, and Nia watched her, then looked back at Ethan, her expression steady. "That is not enough," she said, not dismissing, but clarifying. "Removing him does not restore what was delayed." And Ethan nodded, already understanding that. "No," he said, "it does not." And for a moment, the room held that truth without trying to soften it, without trying to rush past it, because some things could not be undone, only addressed moving forward. Nia took a slow breath, her hand resting lightly against the counter once more as she grounded herself in the present, in the reality of what was unfolding. And then she spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Then you do not just correct the structure," she said. "You correct the timing." And Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. "Explain," he said, and Nia met his gaze directly. "Everything that should have happened weeks ago happens now," she said. "Not privately, not delayed, not filtered through someone else, but directly, visibly, and without hesitation." And the clarity of that instruction left no room for interpretation, no space for adjustment, and Ethan stood there for a moment, letting it settle, letting it define what would come next. And then he nodded once, firm and final. "Then, that is exactly what will happen," he said, and this time, the words did not feel like a response. They felt like a line being drawn forward, something that would either hold under pressure or collapse entirely. And Nia watched him for a long second before giving a small nod, not in approval, but in recognition that the situation had moved beyond discussion, beyond explanation, and into something that would soon be tested outside the walls of this apartment, where silence could no longer contain it. Some moments do not announce themselves as turning points. They simply arrive and leave everything different, and Nia felt that shift settle fully into the room now, not as tension, not as uncertainty, but as something clearer, something grounded, as if the night itself had drawn a line none of them could step back across. She stood still for a second, her gaze moving from Ethan to the woman at the table, then back again, measuring not what had been said, but what had been accepted. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet finality. "Then it starts now," she said, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone, not as a gesture, not as a delay, but as action, immediate and deliberate, and he stepped slightly away, just enough to give the call its own space. His voice low but firm as it connected. "I need Marcus Hale removed from all active operations effective immediately," he said. No explanation, no room for negotiation, just a directive that carried the weight of everything that had just been revealed. And Nia watched him closely, not impressed, not surprised, just attentive, because words backed by action were the only thing that mattered now. And as he continued, "No, this is not up for review. Transfer his responsibilities, revoke access, and I will handle any follow-up personally." The structure that had once kept him distant began to shift in real time. The woman at the table sat still, her hands resting lightly over the sonogram, her breathing slower now, steadier, as if the space around her had finally stopped closing in. And when Ethan ended the call, he did not put the phone away immediately. He held it for a second, as if understanding that what he had just done was not a solution, but a beginning. He turned back toward them, his posture unchanged, but his presence different, no longer controlled by distance, but anchored in the moment. And Nia met his gaze without moving, her expression calm, steady. "That removes him," she said. "It does not define you." And Ethan nodded once, accepting that distinction without resistance. "Then I define that next," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his tone now, no uncertainty, just a clear understanding that what came next would be seen, measured, and remembered. The woman looked at him then, not with expectation, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness that the situation had shifted beyond what she had prepared herself for, and she spoke softly. "I am not asking for perfection," she said. "I am asking for presence." And Ethan met her gaze, his answer immediate. "You will have it," he said. And this time, the words did not feel like a promise. They felt like a commitment already in motion. Nia stepped slightly to the side, creating space between them, not separating, but allowing the moment to exist without her holding it in place, because she understood something they were only beginning to learn, that once truth was set in motion, it did not need to be managed, it needed to be lived. And she looked at both of them one last time, her voice calm, grounded. "This is where it changes," she said, not as a warning, not as a reassurance, but as a fact. And the room held that statement without resistance, because there was nothing left to deny, nothing left to delay. Outside, the city continued its quiet rhythm, unaware of the shift that had taken place behind a single door, unaware that a story that had been hidden, redirected, and reshaped had finally been brought into the open. And inside, three people stood in the aftermath of that truth, not as they had been before the knock, but as they were now, defined not by what had been avoided, but by what had been faced. And for the first time that night, there was no uncertainty about what came next, only the understanding that it would no longer be decided in silence.